In today's story, I want to share what happened on an ordinary afternoon that turned into one of the most uncomfortable and eye-opening experiences of my life, when a stranger decided that my quiet presence on a public bench at a neighborhood playground was suspicious enough to justify calling the police, all because I was sitting alone and minding my own business in a space that technically belongs to everyone. It had been one of those long, draining weekdays where nothing catastrophic happens, but everything feels slightly off. The kind of day where small tensions stack on top of each other until your head feels heavier than it should. And after leaving work early, because I simply could not concentrate anymore, I decided not to go straight back to my apartment where the silence tends to amplify every anxious thought, but instead to stop by the small community park 3 blocks from my building, a park the first had passed hundreds of times and occasionally used when I needed fresh air, even though I do not have children and therefore have no obvious reason in some people's minds to be near a playground. The park itself is modest, with a faded blue slide, a set of swings that squeak rhythmically when pushed to high, a climbing frame shaped like a small castle, and a few wooden benches positioned along the perimeter under trees that offered decent shade. And when I arrived that afternoon, the sky was overcast, but bright enough to cast soft light across the grass, the air cool and calm, with perhaps 5 or 6 children playing while their parents stood nearby chatting in loose clusters, occasionally calling out reminders to be careful or take turns. And I chose a bench slightly removed from the main structure, close enough to hear the ambient sounds of life, but far enough that I was not directly adjacent to any child. I sat down, leaned forward with my elbows resting on my knees, and took out my phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through emails and news headlines, not photographing anyone, not staring at anyone, not attempting to engage anyone in conversation, simply occupying a public bench the way countless other people do every day. And I remember thinking how oddly calming it was to hear the ordinary soundtrack of children laughing and leaves rustling instead of the buzz of fluorescent lights and tense office conversations. After about 10 minutes, however, I began to feel that subtle but unmistakable sensation of being watched, the kind that prickles at the back of your neck before your eyes even confirm it. And when I glanced up casually, I noticed a woman across the playground looking directly at me with an expression that was not curiosity but suspicion, her eyebrows slightly furrowed, her lips pressed thin, and though I initially dismissed it as a passing glance, I saw her lean toward another parent and whisper something while still glancing in my direction, which planted the first seed of discomfort in my otherwise quiet afternoon. I told myself not to overreact, that people look at strangers all the time and it does not necessarily mean anything. And yet the repeated glances continued, growing less subtle and more evaluative, as if my mere presence required explanation. And I became acutely aware of how I must appear from a distance, a man in his 30s, alone, seated near a playground, not visibly supervising a child, not actively exercising, not walking a dog, simply sitting. And in that awareness I recognized the unspoken social narrative that sometimes attaches itself to men in proximity to children, a narrative built not on action, but on assumption. Despite the growing tension, I stayed seated because I genuinely believed I had every right to be there, because I pay taxes that contribute to public spaces, because the bench was not reserved for parents only, because existing quietly should not require justification. And yet that internal defense did little to ease the tightening in my chest when the woman finally broke away from her group and walked toward me with deliberate steps, arms folded tightly across her chest as though bracing herself for confrontation. She stopped several feet in front of me and asked, without greeting or introduction, why I was there, her tone sharp and accusatory rather than curious. And I answered calmly that I lived nearby and had come to sit for a bit after work, expecting that such a straightforward explanation would suffice, but instead she responded by stating, "This is a playground," as though I had somehow failed to notice the bright plastic slide and the children running around. I replied that I understood that and reiterated that I was simply sitting on a public bench, not interfering with anyone, not speaking to anyone, not doing anything inappropriate. But she shook her head and said it was strange for a grown man to sit alone at a playground, framing my presence not as neutral, but inherently suspect. And in that moment I felt a mix of frustration and disbelief, because there was no behavior to defend against, only the intangible weight of her perception. When she turned away abruptly and pulled out her phone, pacing a few steps while speaking into it with urgency, I sensed the situation escalating beyond simple social discomfort. And although I could not hear her exact words, I saw her glance repeatedly in my direction and gesture toward the bench, and a sinking realization settled in that she was likely calling the police. Our EPO or TING not an action, but an unease. Part of me considered leaving immediately to avoid the embarrassment of a scene. Yet another part resisted the idea that I should retreat from a public space, because someone projected fear onto me, and so I remained seated, heart pounding slightly faster than before, aware that even innocence does not prevent scrutiny once authorities are involved. When the patrol car entered the parking lot with its lights flashing, but sirens silent, conversations across the playground stalled mid-sentence, heads turned in unison, and I felt every eye briefly shift toward me, the silent implication hanging in the air before a single word was spoken. And as two officers stepped out and spoke first with the woman who had called, listening to her animated explanation, I stood slowly from the bench so as not to appear evasive or defensive. They approached with professional neutrality and informed me that they had received a report about a suspicious individual near the playground, asking for identification and an explanation of why I was there. And though the word suspicious stung deeply given how ordinary my behavior had been, I complied without argument, handing over my driver's license and calmly describing my short walk from my apartment, and my intention simply to sit outside for a while. While one officer ran my information, the other asked whether I knew anyone at the playground or had spoken to any children, to which I truthfully answered no, explaining that I had kept entirely to myself, and the questions, though routine, carried an undertone that made clear how quickly context can shift once someone frames your presence as potentially threatening. After several minutes that felt much longer than they were, the officers confirmed there were no issues with my record and no reports of inappropriate conduct beyond the initial complaint, and their demeanor softened slightly as one of them stated that while I was not breaking any laws, they were obligated to respond when someone expresses concern involving children, a statement that was logically understandable yet emotionally frustrating because it acknowledged both my innocence and the power of suspicion. What happened next surprised me because rather than instructing me to leave, one of the officers walked back to the woman and explained, within earshot of several parents, that sitting on a public bench is not illegal and that no evidence suggested any wrongdoing, emphasizing that public parks are open to all members of the community unless specific rules are being violated, and I watched her posture stiffen, her certainty faltering as the official validation she seemed to expect did not materialize. She argued briefly, insisting that it was abnormal for a man to sit alone at a playground, and the officer responded calmly that abnormal does not equate to criminal, a distinction that felt both obvious and profound in that moment. And eventually the conversation ended with the officers returning my identification, telling me I was free to remain if I wished, and departing as quietly as they had arrived. As the patrol car pulled away, the playground atmosphere gradually resumed its earlier rhythm, though the undercurrent of awkwardness lingered, and I sat back down not out of stubbornness, but because leaving immediately would have felt like admitting guilt where none existed. And for the next 15 minutes I remained quietly on the bench until families began packing up for dinner, the woman avoiding eye contact entirely. When I finally stood and walked home, the cool air brushing against my face, I reflected not on anger, but on how easily ordinary behavior can be recast as threatening depending on who performs it and who observes it, and how fragile the sense of belonging in shared spaces can be when filtered through bias. And although the incident ended without legal consequence, it left me with a deeper awareness of how perception alone can summon authority, how quickly assumptions can harden into accusations, and how important it is, even in uncomfortable moments, to remain calm and grounded in the simple truth that existing quietly in a public place should never require apology or defense.